Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Holbert. I am a biology GA at the university under Dr. Loafman and Dr. Graham. And today I'm going to be talking about the genus I chose for my slideshow, as well as the specific species I wanted to cover, which is Laticauda colubrina, also known as the yellow-lipped sea krait. So to get into some general taxonomy for the genus, they are within the family Lapidae, which is considered to be true sea snakes, and you'll actually see that this is not necessarily true, especially for Laticauda. The subfamily they are within is Laticaudinae, which actually includes venomous sea snakes as well as some venomous land snakes. They are typically found in Australasia if they are within the subfamily, and this includes species such as taipans. So something interesting about the subfamily is that it was in 2013, it elevated to a family level, which would be Laticaudidae. This familial level was also divided into two genera, including Laticauda and Pseudo-Laticauda, which were actually just based on morphological characteristics. However, just shortly after this was released in 2013, another publication in 2013 came out, pretty much saying that this wasn't true and that they were still within the same subfamily and under a single genus, which is Laticauda. And in general, that was just not widely accepted. So, to talk a little bit more about the clades under marine elapids, there's two major monophyletic clades for these guys. That includes what I'll be talking about, which is clade Lauticaudini, and the Hydrophini, which of course we'll be talking about Lauticaudini. The main differences between these two marine elapid groups is that Lauticaudini lay eggs on land, meaning they are viviparous, and Hydrophini are oviparous, meaning they produce live young in the water. I think that's pretty cool, pretty good way to separate them out. There's actual phylogenetic data also suggesting that these groupings may have evolved from a terrestrial ancestor, as they do retain a lot of terrestrial behaviors and morphological elements. And there's actual genetic data suggesting they may have moved to the water about 8 to 13 million years ago, which in retrospect was not very long. So it's pretty interesting to know that this group may have recently moved to the water and came from some type of terrestrial background. So for the genus itself, Laticauda, there are 8 species within it, 3 of those being general species complexes that incorporate the rest of the species within them. So something important to know about the genus is that these are not sea snakes. Although they are within the group of true sea snakes, they are actually not considered sea snakes. They are called sea kraits. So these sea kraits still have a similar paddle-tailed shape to sea snake, which they use to propel themselves through the water. They do have a flattened body shape, which you can kind of see here in this picture. They are more flat than they are round. They have a banded coloration, and they actually maintain large ventral scales on the underside of their body, which is pretty cool. And they have lungs, which are super important to the fact that they do have ties to terrestrial origins and behaviors. They actually also have lost the overlapping scales, which is common in other species, to prevent marine parasites from anchoring onto them underneath those scales or in between the overlapping sections. And they frequently shed their skin or their scales to prevent marine parasites from attaching long term, which is pretty cool. They have a tight set of lip scales around their mouth and valvular nostrils to prevent any water from getting in. And they do have some gas exchange through their skin, but it's more typically through breathing air when they reach the surface with their lungs. So those complexes I was talking about, again, there are specifically 3 Laticauda complexes, and they're all based around what we call a mother species. So the mother species for the three complexes is my species, L. colubrina, and then you have L. laticauda and L. semifasciaria. Now, all of these species tend to have a broader range than the species that fall within those complexes. So the species under them are typically a lot more limited or endemic, but do tend to cross ranges with those more broad members of the complex. There are also some morphological characteristics, such as coloration and other factors, that do separate them out. And there are genetic studies being done on these guys so that they can further be split up into species as needed. So another way to define these three complexes is by the yellow banded, black banded, and blue banded kraits. So yellow banded is my species L. colubrina, which includes more terrestrial species. The blue banded, which is L. Laticauda, which are considered more intermediate and they spend an equal amount of time between the land and the water. And then you have L. semifasciaria, which is the black banded group, and they tend to be the more aquatic kraits. So for the Laticauda colubrina complex, of course, you have Laticauda colubrina, and originally this consisted of many different species before any analysis was done on it, but eventually, once genetics came out and ranges were more well studied, three species came off of these guys. So, of course, you have your wide ranged colubrina, which we'll talk a little bit more about their description and distribution in a little bit. But L. frontalis, L. santacronici, and L. guinea were described off of them based on their more endemic ranges. So what's super cool too is that more recently described was L. guinea, and of course, based on the name, you can tell that it was described and is endemic to New Guinea. This analysis actually had 1,515 specimens within it, and they found 33 distinct characteristics between them, which is what led to these species distinctions. They're all still considered to be part of the L. colubrina complex, again, also known as the yellow-banded sea kraits, and all of them are more terrestrial than some of these other sea krait groups within Laticauda. So the general morphology of everyone following this complex is that they tend to have ontogenic melanism, which is pretty cool. It is the progressive darkening of the skin, meaning that over time, those dark bands that you see along their body will become more of a black-brown color and start out a lot lighter. They also have that light blue-gray dorsal scales that you see, and their ventral scales are yellow. Their bands for the black and brown do actually run all the way around, but they do have yellow ventral scales, and these yellow scales do extend into their lips, their upper eyes, and their head, which is where colubrina gets its common name, the yellow-lipped sea krait. Males of this grouping tend to be about 29 to 39 inches, specifically for L. colubrina, and females tend to be much larger at about 60 inches. Something else super interesting is that typically they have about 35 to 55 of those black bands across the entire length of their body. So getting more into that distribution I mentioned, where we have some super endemics as well as a very wide range for our mother species. That mother species, L. colubrina, again, is found along major coasts along Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Solomon Islands, Myanmar, Tonga, Fiji, Vanuatu, and even New Guinea. And this large range has allowed for that extreme morphological variation as these specific species have became endemic in specific regions, specialized on specific prey items or specific environments. Something pretty cool about the general distribution of these guys, at least even within the genus, is that there is a species of sea krait that will never enter the sea. So this is Laticauda crocori. It is a sea krait that lives in Lake Tanago on Rennell Island, which is part of the Solomon Islands. And this sea krait will actually never leave this lake. It is endemic to this region and stays there. And it's more of the aquatic side of the krait, so it's within that grouping. And something neat is that L. colubrina will actually move into this lake from the sea and eat eels within this region, while L. crockeri eats specifically an endemic lake goby. So they persist alongside each other, specializing on different types of prey. And it's just super cool that colubrina will move from the sea into this lake just to feed specifically on the eels there. So here's some images to give you guys a better just idea of what that distribution really looks like. So again, here's L. colubrina, that very widespread species. You can see why it's considered to be the mother species of the complex. Again, runs from southern Japan into Indonesia. You can see that it's on the Solomon Islands and New Guinea and all of these places. This map could be drastically updated as well, as it's a little bit old, but surely they have possibly expanded their range even further at this point. And something interesting to note for later is that these sea kraits are not found in India, but they do play a decent role there. So keep in mind that information for later, as we'll come back to it. But to continue on with our distribution maps, you have L. frontalis, which I mentioned is an endemic. So all of these next three are those major endemics we talked about coming off of the complex. This one is endemic to the Loyalty Islands and Vanuatu, which you can see highlighted in the box here in the bottom corner. It actually shares the range in Vanuatu specifically with L. colubrina, which is super cool. Then you have L. sangronisi, which is found in New Caledonia and the Loyalty Islands. And where it occurs within the Loyalty Islands, it's actually found with frontalis. So you're seeing a back-to-back range amongst some of these species where they can be found coexisting together, and in other places they're not found together at all, and it's just a single species. So our last one here is L. guinea, and of course it is found within two areas in southern Papua New Guinea. And you can see here on the map, they're very small regions of Papua New Guinea, and they're separated out from everybody else. That was found along those island chains to the southeast. But it's super cool to know that even though they were recently described and not very much is known about them, we do know that they do expand at least two coastal ranges within Papua New Guinea. So we get to habitat specifics for Laticauda and especially Laticauda colubrina. We know that these sea kraits prefer warm, tropical, or subtropical coastal waters, and they actually utilize beaches that are submerged at high tide, as they like to hide under the substrates and rocks and debris that can be found when it washes up onto these beaches. They really like coral islands, coral reefs, and mangrove swamps. When they are spending their time on land, you can find them in old growth coastal forests. But when they're feeding, you can find them, like in this image, in coral reefs where they're hunting specifically eels and things like that. And when they're up on the land, they actually use fallen trees and other debris as a land refuge. They use rocks, anything that's pretty natural. They don't use anything that's man-made as far as we know, unless it's anecdotal evidence. And typically, when they are in the water along these coasts, if they're not hunting, they're found in less than 10 meters of water. When they are hunting, they do extend further out into their range, but they typically stay very close to these coastal islands, these beaches, and everything else, and they don't really leave the area of which they were born. So if they're spending a lot of time in the water, as far as we know, but they have these terrestrial adaptations that they never lost or maybe have readapted over time, are they land-based or are they sea-based? Especially because we know that these are within the yellow-banded group, which is more terrestrial. So let's talk about some of those terrestrial characteristics. They are oviparous, as I mentioned before, meaning they lay those eggs on land. This is super important as it's not the only behavior they produce on land. They actually will digest their food on the land, they will rest, they will shed, and they actually do their mating rituals on the land as well. They do feed in the water, which is where they're hunting, but they move to the land and spend significant time there. They also have maintained those ventral scales for this terrestrial movement, as you can see in the image on the bottom, where the sea krait is moving across the beach. And it's not very easy to move across the sand, so it's important that they have those large ventral scales to help them move. And in the top picture, you can see them in the water, and they're likely spending time there when they're feeding. And it's super cool that they spend time within these coral reefs because the prey that they eat is very endemic to these regions. So when they go out to find it, they will always go out to a similar location and then move back to the land. So are they land or sea kraits? Well, I guess you could consider them both krait. Studies show that sea kraits may utilize not only just saltwater, but freshwater environments, and they do spend a large amount of time, at least within this grouping, on the land. They can actually spend up to 10 days on the land. Again, some of the other complexes and groups within the genus may spend less time on land and more time in the water, but specifically the ones we are focusing on today do spend quite a bit of time on land and only utilize the water mostly for feeding. So let's talk about their venom and their diet a little bit here. So something interesting about these sea kraits is that they have a neurotoxic venom. It's actually very, very potent and it is used to paralyze prey. So upon paralysis, it can actually cause rapid death. This typically has to do with convulsions, cardiovascular failure, respiratory arrest. In people, if you are bit, which is very unlikely, it can cause dizziness, again, convulsions, unconsciousness, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, bluish skin, and in extreme cases, casualty. Again, it's very unlikely that they would bite a person, but it can cause death in people. So very important to watch out for, but very interesting as well, because they do use this neurotoxic venom in order to specify on the prey of choice, which is eels. So specifically, L. colubrina is an eel specialist. They do occasionally eat bony fish, but they focus mainly on eels. In these images here, you can see that they're swallowing eels that are much larger than their own bodies, which is pretty cool. I did have a video, but the video would not play. So to describe it to you all, they use that neurotoxic venom and they will latch on to the eels. It causes them to freeze up. Again, they get paralyzed. They're unable to truly fight back, which is a super important factor as eels are very dangerous and they will literally swallow the eel whole while it is alive. So even though it is paralyzed, it may not die immediately and it will just completely engulf it. The males of these species will actually hunt multiple prey items at a time. That doesn't mean they will always eat all the prey items, but they have been seen to do so. Females typically will only hunt one prey item and then move to the land to digest. So it's very interesting that males have this specific behavior. We're unsure what it could possibly be for or what it means, but the females also hunt in much deeper waters than the males do. So the males will stay in that general less than 10-meter range if they can. Females can move all the way out to 60 meters offshore to hunt before returning. So some predators of these sea kraits include white-breasted sea eagles, as well as elasmobranchs and tiger sharks. You can actually see in this image here, the white-breasted sea eagle is holding on to some type of sea snake or sea krait. So they're very well known for doing this and displaying this behavior. I didn't know until recently that elasmobranchs, such as the tiger sharks, would eat sea kraits, but that's super interesting. And they must, again, move to find those prey sources within the coral reefs or when they're swimming in open water and capture them. So for those general life strategies between even both just adults and juveniles, there's not a whole lot of information. And this tends to be because they're very elusive, especially within the juvenile stage. The females lay their eggs in very secluded spots, and it's very hard to find them. So there's not a lot of information out there, but this is what we generally know. So females will mature between 1.5 to 2 years of age, and then males will mature a little bit faster at 1 to 1.5 years old. When they do move up to the land to mate, the female will lay her eggs in a very secluded place along the beaches, along the forest, and then once the eggs hatch, the juveniles will actually move to the water and spend more time in the water than they would on the land. They don't really develop that terrestrial behavior until they become adults. Once they become adults, you'll see that turn to a more terrestrial life strategy where they're moving to the land a lot more often. They also exhibit high levels of philopatry, which is very interesting, meaning that they often stay around the islands or the coast of which they were originally born. So that also contributes to the factor of many of these endemic species in the complex where these sea kraits are being born in a very, very specific region. They're not spreading out, and as they are becoming genetically um, variating from the rest of the sea kraits within the complex, they become more and more endemic and genetically different from those other species. So some general threats that you may see in these environments for these sea kraits, your typical coastal issues that includes coastal development for human recreation, that includes general habitat loss, where it could be climate change related, where rising waters are reducing that available coastal habitat. It's really, really important that these individuals have shelters within 1 to 5 meters of the shoreline, as the shelters there are extremely important for them to be able to rest and to lay eggs and to digest. And without this, it becomes extremely hard for them to survive. Old growth coastal forests, which do not exist a whole lot anymore, they tend to be far and few between, are actually extremely important for these populations as well. And they tend to host large populations, especially on the land when they're moving up. And without them, and as things are being cut down and we're losing this habitat, and we're losing the beach not only to recreation but to general climate change and the coasts, um, we're losing ground with the coast because of the water. It just becomes more difficult for these sea kraits to survive. There's also issues with hunting and bycatch. In southern Japan, they're actually hunted quite often. Sometimes they've actually had notes of being caught quite often in their bycatch as well. So even when they're not actively targeting them, they do get stuck in those fishing nets along the coast as well when they're just trying to catch crabs or fish and other things. And they're often killed. They're not usually released. So that does cause issues with population decline. So, with all these issues, luckily, these sea kraits are still considered globally least concern by IUCN. Something that's very interesting is that the only place they have protection is in India. And although they are not found in India, they have a Schedule 2 species protection under their Wildlife Protection Act in 2022. This essentially helps prevent any trade, any bycatch moving in and out, any extra hunting that's occurring to these species along the surrounding islands. So it kind of just helps manage the general area a little bit better, even though the islands where they're actually found do not necessarily have the same protections in place. So to end out here, we have a couple fun facts about the sea kraits. So like I mentioned before, they're generally non-aggressive, but a study in 2018 actually found that camera flashes when tourists were taking pictures and were on the beach and there was a sea krait there, camera flashes specifically caused aggression within the sea kraits, not any of the other activities that were taking place there, which is very interesting. There's also a species of eel known as Myrichthes colubrinus, again, named very similar to L. colubrina. This is called the banded snake eel, and you can see it in the image here. It looks very similar to L. colubrina, and it actually has mimicked the general pattern that you see in order to avoid large predation issues with the sea krait. Sadly, this does not always work, as the sea krait will still eat these eels, but it does actually help other predators and some of the sea kraits. Uh, it helps them avoid these extra predation causes, which is super cool. And with that, that ends my talk. I hope you all enjoyed it and have a good afternoon, evening, or morning.